So anyway, we'll switch it up a little bit, and I'm going to talk with you this morning about the role of frontline actors in environmental regulation, notably the regulators who work in state government environmental protection agencies like the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. The basis of my talk this morning comes from a recently published book of the same name, which has been the product of years of research into this critical population across many states. Now, before I get into the significance of regulators and their regulatory interactions, it's important to set the stage and consider our perceptions. After all, I've just mentioned the word regulators, which is probably not conjuring up positive images or positive thoughts in any of your mind. But the question invariably becomes, are these negative perceptions that we all think of, are they indicative of reality? Now, when we think of environmental regulators, we invariably hold one of a few perceptions. One view might be of the tree-hugging hippie bureaucrats who are out to get hardworking American industries and put them out of business in their zealous pursuit of environmental protection. Or we might think of lazy, incompetent bureaucrats who are regulators because they can't get a job doing anything else, and they're completely inept when it comes to protecting the environment from the nefarious profit-driven corporations who will use and abuse the environment unless we stop them. And when we think about government and regulation, our thoughts often turn to the federal level of government, which summons images these days of partisan bickering by members of Congress who routinely take a month's vacation and then come back from vacation scheduling 4 legislative workdays in the 9 weeks between then and Election Day. So it's not much of a surprise that nothing seems to get done. Therefore, it's easy to neglect the 88,000 and some odd state and local government entities around the nation. As is so often the case, our perceptions about environmental regulation are not indicative of reality and grossly oversimplify a much more complex apparatus. Although it's natural to think of our disdain for the partisan bickering in the halls of Congress and equate it to the entirety of government, government is not a monolithic entity. We have the federal structure of government in which most of the work of government is done at the local and at the state level, and this is true with environmental protection. States are overwhelmingly responsible for implementation of environmental regulations by issuing permits and monitoring compliance with those permit conditions. In other words, states do the work of environmental regulation by issuing permits to companies and then visiting those companies to make sure they're complying. This is not the work of the federal government and the US EPA, for example, what we might often think. This is the work of state agencies and even here in Ohio, local agencies. These subnational governments are the ones responsible for doing the work. And notably, the doing of government has much to do with the individuals on the front lines. And in particular, I'd like to draw our attention to 2 different groups of individuals. The state-level regulators, or the Lilliputians, borrowing from Jonathan Swift, as they are called in the book, and the individuals who are employed by the regulated firms and are tasked with implementing regulations across hundreds of thousands of firms. And let's spend a few minutes talking about these 2 groups. Environmental regulators or environmental inspectors are individuals predominantly at state environmental agencies, and they are tasked with monitoring and assessing compliance with federal and state regulations they frequently have nothing to do with creating. To make these determinations about compliance, regulators conduct physical site inspections. They review lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of paperwork, lots of reports, and they keep track of all of those records. Now, one might assume that a regulator spends most of his or her time out in the field visiting facilities, but the opposite is true. Vast majority of their time is spent in the office. Regulators typically specialize in one of the major environmental media, air, water, solid, or hazardous waste. And they're responsible for anywhere from dozens of facilities to several hundred. It's important to point out that these facilities may or may not have a lot in common. For instance, an air regulator can be responsible for a power plant, a hospital, a metal foundry, a printing press, and even a hospital and a university. This means she's got to keep up with the ins and outs of the operations for a range of facilities, and those operations are constantly changing. So this sounds easy, of course. Oh, and I should mention that these regulators are almost uniformly entry-level positions in state agencies, and their pay scale is commensurate with that organizational rank. Next, we turn to the perspective of the regulated community. The job of the regulated community is far more involved than you might think. Of course, central to the regulated community's work in this context is complying with those regulations, and this entails staying current on evolving regulations at the local, state, and federal level. And it entails understanding these regulations, which are often wrought with legalese, and how those regulations may or may not affect their business. And it entails figuring out exactly what to do. Members of the regulated community, on top of it, don't just have one regulator that they have to deal with. They may have an air regulator, they may have a water regulator, they may have several waste regulators. Think for a minute of your average auto supplier in Ohio that has local air inspectors, state water and waste inspectors, and then may have federal inspectors, federal EPA show up too. And there's not just one point of contact in those agencies for that facility. And they may even get different answers from the agency from different points of contact. It's also important to think about small businesses here. For example, small businesses aren't going to have the workforce. Big, large corporations have staffs devoted to environmental compliance. If we're talking about our local dry cleaner, which is subject to an air permit, it's probably the owner who's doing everything else on top of it. The point is that environmental compliance can be handled by one people and it can be handled by hundreds within a facility, and that matters. I'm really focused on the interactions of these two actors. So why are they so important? Well, quite simply, the interactions of the regulator and the members of the regulated community, constitute the implementation of policy. And I don't know how you can not focus on policy implementation in this context. Moreover, the individuals in these interactions have to figure out how to make compliance with regulations happen. The laws written by Congress and the regulations written by rule writers may or may not be clear. They may or may not be doable, and they may or may not take into consideration reality. How they make sense of these rules and directives constitutes environmental policy implementation, and how these actors work together is the crux of that. It doesn't take long to realize that the work on the front lines is generally what it's all about, and there are probably pretty widely held perceptions about the implementation of environmental regulations, and those misperceptions are infrequently countered because so little is actually known about these groups of actors and their interactions. Now, we've discussed perceptions a bit, but we should also know that when we talk about the perceptions of these interactions, we typically think that they're adversarial and pretty contentious. What these interactions are actually like is the focus of this book, and again, because it constitutes environmental regulation. Now, I spent time working for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and I held many of these negative perceptions. And yet, I realized working with air inspectors, these interactions are actually really quite productive, quite cooperative, and this is probably a good thing. And this galvanized this academic research. So let me turn to the study that informed this book. My co-author, Sarah Renfrey at the University of Montana, and I decided first to look at the regulators' perceptions, or their side of the story, if you will. And we're now at the beginning stages of turning our attention to the regulated community. Now, for our study, we designed an online survey, and we had more than 1,200 regulators from across 17 states participate, representing the range of environmental media I've mentioned a few moments ago, and in a range of states with differing levels of commitment and capacity to deal with environmental protection. Time's not going to permit me to go into a lot of detail, but I'd like to highlight a few of the results. One topic we explored was, what do regulators actually think about their regulatory counterparts? Are their perceptions as negative as public perceptions might have us believe? The short answer is no. An overwhelming majority of regulators believe the regulated community makes an honest attempt to comply with regulations. More than half of the regulators surveyed said the regulated community even knows what they're supposed to be doing. And only a small percentage of regulators thought the regulated community is solely driven by profit and not other concerns like environmental protection. Regulators were also asked about their interactions with the regulated community. An astonishing 83% of the regulators in this study said their interactions with the regulated community are positive, and only 4% described their interactions as negative. Again, rather startling finding considering common perceptions of these interactions. Another common thought that abounds about regulators is that they are like environmental cops, minus, of course, the green flashing lights and badges. And so the regulatory literature has long presumed that these regulators employ one of two approaches to their regulatory counterparts. Either they take a strict, by the book, exactly what the rules say and that's it approach, where any violation merits enforcement, or regulators take a lax and more flexible, more accommodative approach to work with industry in terms of compliance. Now, there are pluses and minuses to each of these regulatory enforcement styles, but little's actually known about what the actual people on the front lines actually do. And it's presumed that regulators do one of either, or embrace either style. Our study reveals that regulators do not typically embody one of the two approaches when they deal with members of the regulated community. Instead, 3/4 of regulators who responded indicated that they employ a combination of styles when they interact with the regulated community. Now, these results make a lot of sense if you actually stop and think about it, and we can tell that the interactions are far more complex than a binary sort of approach. And I think it's important to talk about maybe cooperative, maybe positive interactions are really a good thing. They might even, and that might be shocking for some of us as we think about, well, maybe this is improper. After all, you have regulators monitoring compliance. Should they get along? We maintain that cooperative regulation or cooperative interactions are desirable and should be encouraged. First, when interactions are generally positive, you get engaged, open, and honest communication. Communication is essential to making regulation happen on the front lines. We've already seen that regulators can have hundreds of facilities that they're responsible for and a range of different kinds of operations. So there's no way for them realistically to keep up with the latest and greatest technologies. So you need frank conversation between the regulators and the regulated community. And the regulated community needs the regulators to help them, particularly the smaller operations, make sense of the convoluted regulatory apparatus that's governing environmental protection. There has to be an openness on the part of the regulated community to talk to their regulator rather than hide stuff from their regulator. And ultimately, with better communication, the literature indicates that you get better regulatory outcomes. Second, with better communication, you can have more cooperation. If you're comfortable talking to your regulator and you don't loathe your interactions with him, odds are you're going to be more willing to cooperate with him. Third, and relatedly, if you're having issues with compliance and you have a strong sense of cooperation and openness with your regulator, you're probably more inclined to reach out and proactively seek help rather than hiding it. And from the other side of things, if a regulator feels as though her interactions are positive and cooperative, and she finds a problem, she's going to probably be focused on getting the issue resolved in an efficient and cooperative manner rather than taking a hostile or an aggressive posture. Finally, and as I mentioned, not just my own research points to the fact that good interactions enhance rates of compliance for many reasons. Think about it for a moment. If you're a member of the regulated community and you have good interactions with your water inspector, you're going to work with them. And you realize that your inspector's not out to get you. With this research, we found that the role of the regulator isn't quite what we thought it might have been. And we're trying to draw attention to the significance of their work. It would be easy to assume that regulators think ill of their regulatory counterparts, but this study counters that. Indeed, it's refreshing because if you stop and think about it, you want people to work together and be productive in the workplace. More specifically, this research calls the role of regulators to evolve in recognition of their actual work and experiences. Now, how might we achieve this enhanced role for regulators? Well, a number of things need to happen. First, the complexity of regulations needs to be reduced. And I find it fascinating to hear that overwhelmingly one of the biggest complaints regulators tell us is not the regulated community, mind you, is that the regulations are too complex, too convoluted, and don't make any sense. These regulators also need to be included in devising these regulations because they're the ones with the practical front lines, hands-on experience. They need to be encouraged to help solve problems and build relationships with their regulatory counterparts. And they need the resources to do it, as these regulators are routinely overworked and their divisions routinely understaffed. A better understanding of these roles of these actors on the front lines invariably has implications for the future. And if we can work on some of these things, I think there could be some significant positive implications for environmental policy and a pathway for a more responsive regulatory framework, while potentially sidestepping some of the challenges that we have with a Congress that's unwilling to engage on the topic. Better interactions and a greater inclusion of those on the front lines in devising regulations can lead to better outcomes. And all the while, negative, pervasive stereotypes can be combated. In the end, we're all in this together. We all live in the same environment and depend on its health. So thanks for coming this morning.